I need to tell you about the moment my ex-wife's father tore up a $15,000 check in front of my son, called it worthless, and told me I'd always be nothing. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened after that in order, because some of it took 10 years to play out, and I think you're going to want to see every step of it. My name is Daniel. I'm 46, and 2 years ago, the same man who tore up that check stood in a boardroom and had no idea he was about to lose his job because of a decision I'd made a decade earlier, a decision he never even knew I was capable of making. But let's start where it actually started, because you need to feel the whole weight of that moment the way I did. It was a Tuesday afternoon at Rachel's parents' house, my ex-wife. We'd been divorced 6 years by then, and I was there because my son Ethan, he was 11 at the time, needed a procedure on his shoulder that our insurance wasn't going to fully cover. I'd scraped together $15,000 over for months, working extra shifts, selling off equipment I didn't strictly need, and I'd written a check and brought it over so Rachel could add it to what she and her new husband Gregory were already covering. I wanted to do my part. I wanted Ethan to know his father showed up, even for the parts that were hard. Richard, that's Rachel's father, a senior vice president at one of the regional banks, was sitting at the kitchen table when I handed the check to Rachel. He picked it up before she even had a chance to look at it, glanced at the amount, and just laughed. Not a mean laugh exactly. More like the laugh you give when something's genuinely absurd to you. $15,000, he said, like he was testing how the number sounded out loud. Danny, Gregory's going to cover the rest of this in about 4 seconds without noticing it left his account. You don't need to do this. And then he tore the check in half right there at the table and set the pieces down next to my coffee cup. Put it toward your own rent, he said. I mean that kindly. Ethan was standing in the doorway. He'd heard the whole thing. I watched his face do something I still think about, that particular kind of hurt that happens when a kid realizes the adults in the room think his father is a joke, and he doesn't yet have the tools to argue with that. I didn't say anything to Richard. I picked up the 2 halves of that check, folded them together, and put them in my jacket pocket. I still have them, actually. I'll tell you why later. I want to take you back further, though, because that moment at the kitchen table didn't come from nowhere. It was the accumulation of about 10 years of Richard deciding, very early and very firmly, exactly what kind of man I was, and never once revisiting that decision. No matter what actually happened in my life, Rachel and I got married young, 24 and 22. I was working as a dispatcher for a regional freight company. Decent job, nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills and I was good at it. Good enough that within a few years, I was running logistics for 3 of the company's biggest accounts. Richard never thought much of that job. He'd worked his way up at the bank over 30 years, wore a suit every day of his life, and I think in his mind, a man who spent his career on a headset coordinating truck routes was never quite going to be a man at all. Not in the way that mattered to him. When Ethan was born, things were good for a while. Rachel and I struggled with money the way most young couples do, but we were happy, genuinely happy, for those first few years. The trouble started when I decided to leave the freight company and start my own logistics consulting business. Small operation, just me and a laptop at first, helping smaller regional shippers optimize their routes and contracts. The exact kind of work I'd been doing for someone else's paycheck for years, except now I wanted to do it for my own. I needed a small business loan to get through the first 18 months, nothing enormous. $40,000 to cover software, a proper office setup, some contract work I needed help with. I went to Richard's bank because it made sense, because I figured family connections should count for something. Richard was 2 levels above the loan officer I actually met with. But I found out later, years later, that he'd personally flagged my application and recommended denial. Not because the numbers didn't work. They did. I'd run them myself a dozen times, and so had the loan officer, who told me privately, months afterward, that my application had actually been a strong one. Richard denied it anyway. He told Rachel, at the time, that he didn't think I had the discipline to run something like that, and he didn't want the bank's money, or by extension, his daughter's future, riding on my discipline. I didn't find any of that out until much later. At the time, I just got a rejection letter and figured the numbers hadn't worked. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it matters for what comes later. I spent years believing my own math had failed me, when actually, it was never about the math at all. I found a way around it. I always found a way around things. That's sort of become the theme of my whole life, if I'm honest. I maxed out to credit cards, borrowed for $1,000 from a friend I paid back within a year, and I built the business slower and scrappier than I'd planned, working nights and weekends on top of freelance dispatching gigs just to keep the lights on. Rachel supported me through most of that first year. Richard did not. Every family dinner came with some version of the same commentary. How's the little business going? Are you sure this was the responsible choice? Have you thought about just going back to a real job? I want to be fair to him. I don't think he was trying to be cruel. I think he genuinely believed he was right about me, and he never once seemed to consider that he might not be. The marriage didn't survive those years, and I won't pretend the business stress wasn't part of why. Rachel and I grew apart the way people sometimes do, not through some single dramatic betrayal, just slowly, through years of different pressures pulling us in different directions. We separated when Ethan was 7. The divorce was, all things considered, fairly civil. Custody was shared, roughly 50-50, though I want to be honest that there was a period, right around the divorce, when Richard actively pushed Rachel toward pursuing full custody, arguing directly to her, and I only learned this years later from Rachel herself, after things between us had healed enough that she told me the truth, that I was, in his words, not a stable enough foundation for a child. Rachel didn't pursue it. She knew better than her father did what kind of father I actually was, even in the hardest years. I've never stopped being grateful to her for that. Whatever else went wrong between us, I do want to tell you about the one custody hearing that did happen, though, because it's relevant to everything that came after. About 4 months into the separation, before things had fully settled, Richard hired a family law attorney, on his own, without Rachel's knowledge at first, to explore whether grounds existed for a more restrictive custody arrangement. He never told me this directly. I found out because the attorney's office called my apartment by mistake, looking for Rachel, and left a voicemail referencing the Hale custody matter that made absolutely no sense, until I pieced together, over the following week, exactly whose initiative it actually was. When Rachel found out what her father had done behind her back, she was furious with him in a way I'd genuinely never seen before. She shut the whole thing down within days. But I sat in a courthouse hallway for 2 hours that week, waiting for a preliminary hearing that ultimately never happened, dressed in the only suit I owned, going over in my head everything I might need to say to convince a stranger in a robe that I deserved to keep raising my own son. Ethan was at school that day, completely unaware that anyone had ever questioned whether he'd keep sleeping in his room. At my apartment every other week, I remember sitting in that hallway thinking that no amount of business success was ever going to matter to Richard if he'd already decided, on principle, that a man with an unstable income didn't deserve equal time with his own child. That was the first time I understood exactly how far he was willing to go. The hearing got called off before it started, once Rachel intervened, but I never forgot that hallway. I think about it more than I think about almost anything else from that period. The lowest point, if I'm being honest with you, came about 2 years after the divorce. My business had grown to 4 employees by then, a real operation, finally profitable, finally something I was proud of. And then a partner I'd brought on, a guy named Kessler, someone I trusted enough to give operational access to our client contracts, quietly redirected 2 of our biggest accounts to a competing firm. He'd started building on the side, without telling me, for almost 5 months before I found out. By the time I discovered it, we'd lost 60% of our revenue overnight. I had to lay off 3 of my 4 employees, and I genuinely did not know, for about 6 weeks that spring, whether I was going to be able to make rent on the small apartment where Ethan stayed with me every other week. I found out about Kessler almost by accident. One of our former clients called my cell phone directly, confused, asking why they'd received 2 nearly identical invoices from 2 different companies in the same month, both claiming to handle the same shipping lane. I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, doing the math out loud while the client waited on the other end, and feeling something cold settle into my stomach as I realized exactly what had been happening under my own roof for months. I confronted Kessler the next morning. He didn't even bother denying it with much conviction, just shrugged and told me he figured I'd have done the same thing in his position, which I think bothered me more than the theft itself did. I never took him to court. I didn't have the money to fight that battle even if I'd wanted to, and some part of me just wanted it over with as fast as possible so I could start rebuilding. I remember one night that spring specifically. Ethan was 9. He'd asked me, completely innocently, why we didn't have cable anymore, and I told him some version of the truth, that money was tight for a little while, that it would get better. He said, "That's okay, Dad. Grandpa Richard says you're bad with money anyway." 9 years old, repeating something he'd clearly heard more than once. I didn't correct him. I just told him I loved him and we'd figure it out together. And we went back to watching whatever we could find without cable that night. That same spring, right in the middle of everything else, Ethan got sick. Not dramatically at first, a fever that wouldn't break. Then some swelling in his joints that the pediatrician initially dismissed as a virus, working its way through his system. It took almost 3 weeks and 2 different doctors before anyone took it seriously enough to run the blood work that eventually diagnosed a fairly serious autoimmune flare, the kind that required specialist visits. I genuinely did not know how I was going to afford on top of everything else that was falling apart that same month. I remember sitting in a pediatric rheumatologist's waiting room, doing math on a napkin, specialist copays against what was left in my business account after Kessler, against rent, against groceries, while Ethan sat next to me reading a comic book, completely unaware that his father was quietly panicking to feet away from him. I called Rachel that week and told her the truth about the money, which wasn't something I did often. To her credit, she and Gregory covered the specialist visits without making it a whole conversation, without turning it into evidence for anything. It was Richard who turned it into evidence. A few months later, at a family dinner, when he brought up, apropos of nothing, in front of Ethan, how fortunate it was that Gregory had been able to step in during Ethan's illness, since apparently I hadn't been in a position to. Ethan was 11 by then, old enough to catch the undertone even if he didn't fully understand where it came from. I didn't say anything at that dinner either. I was getting fairly practiced, by that point, at not saying anything. I want to be honest that I came close to quitting during that stretch, close to calling it, going back to dispatching for someone else, taking the stable paycheck, giving Ethan the version of stability that Richard had always insisted I couldn't provide on my own terms. What kept me going, if I'm honest, wasn't some grand vision of proving anyone wrong. It was much smaller than that. It was Ethan asking me, most weekends, whether he could come see the trucks. He loved coming to the small warehouse space I still rented, loved watching the routing software light up different colored paths across a map, loved it the way some kids loved dinosaurs or space. I wasn't going to be the guy who quit the thing his kid loved watching him build. Not without trying every option first. So I rebuilt, slower than before, more carefully. I brought on 1 employee at a time, vetted everyone twice as hard as I had Kessler, and I started specializing in something narrower, cold chain logistics, specifically the routing and compliance side for regional food distributors, a niche most bigger firms found too complicated to bother optimizing properly. It turned out to be exactly the kind of problem I was good at solving. Within 3 years, we'd grown from that near collapse back up to 15 employees, and we'd landed to contracts with distributors operating across 4 states. The person who probably deserves more credit for that rebuild than anyone, including me, was a woman named Priya Nair, who I hired about 8 months after the Kessler collapse as our first operations manager. She'd been laid off from a much larger logistics firm during a corporate restructuring, overqualified for what I could afford to pay her at the time. And she took the job anyway because, as she told me years later, she liked that I answered every one of her questions honestly during the interview. Instead of pretending things were more stable than they were, Priya was the one who pushed me toward the cold chain specialization in the first place. She'd seen the gap in that market at her old company, and always felt nobody was taking it seriously. She was also the one who sat with me, more than once, during the genuinely bleak stretches, reminding me that the business was recovering even when it didn't feel that way. From inside the day-to-day panic of making payroll, I don't think I tell her often enough how much of Cold Harbor's second act belongs to her, as much as it belongs to me. She's our chief operating officer now, and she'll be the first to tell you she has no intention of ever calling herself anything less than a full partner in what we built. And she'd be right to say it. I want to tell you about one more dinner, because I think it shows how slowly these things actually change. Not all at once, not with some single dramatic reversal. This one happened when Ethan was 14, about a year before the acquisition finally closed. We were all at Rachel and Gregory's place for a birthday dinner, and Richard, almost as a passing comment, asked what Cold Harbor's revenue looked like that year, not with the usual undertone, just genuine, almost surprised curiosity, because he'd apparently heard from Rachel that we'd landed the national grocery contract. I told him the number, plainly no performance in either direction. He went quiet for a second, then said, "That's a serious number, Danny," and moved on to ask Ethan about school. That it wasn't an apology. It wasn't even really an acknowledgement of everything that had come before it. But it was the first time in over a decade that Richard had asked me a direct question about my work, with something other than skepticism sitting underneath it. And I noticed it enough that I still remember exactly where I was sitting at that table when he asked it. Rachel noticed too. I caught her glance across the table, the kind of look that says, without any words, "Did you hear that too?" Small shifts like that one happened maybe 3 or 4 more times over the following year, each one a little less guarded than the last, right up until the day of the torn check finally got fully answered, all at once, by numbers neither of us had fully seen coming. I still didn't tell my ex-wife's family much of anything about how things were actually going. Partly pride, I'll admit that. Partly because every time I'd shared good news in earlier years, it had been met with some version of polite skepticism. That stung worse than outright dismissal would have. So I just stopped sharing. I showed up for Ethan's school events in whatever I happened to be wearing that day, drove whatever truck I happened to be driving for work, and let Richard believe whatever version of me was easiest for him to believe. It cost me nothing to let him keep thinking I was struggling. It cost me nothing, that is, until that afternoon at the kitchen table with the torn check, when I realized just how little that man actually thought of me. Even after everything, I didn't do anything dramatic after that day. I want to be clear about that, because I know where these stories usually go. And I don't think I'm the kind of person who plots elaborate comeuppance. I went home, I put those to halves of a torn check in a drawer, and I went back to work the next morning like I had every morning for the past decade. But something did shift in me after that day, and I think it's worth naming honestly. I stopped being quite so careful about staying small in front of that family, not out of spite. I want to be precise about that, but because I realized that my own instinct to hide my success, to avoid seeming like I was showing off, had somehow let a grown man tear up a check meant for his own grandson's medical care, and feel completely justified doing it. That felt like a mistake on my part, not just his. Over the next 18 months, my company, I'd named it Cold Harbor Logistics somewhere in that second growth phase, expanded into 3 more states. We picked up a contract with a national grocery chain's regional distribution arm, the kind of client that changes a small company's entire trajectory overnight. By the time Ethan turned 13, Cold Harbor had 62 employees and had become, without my fully realizing it was happening in real time, one of the more attractive acquisition targets in regional cold chain logistics. I got the first serious acquisition offer about 8 months after that. A larger logistics conglomerate wanted to fold Cold Harbor into their existing network, and the number they put on the table, after 2 rounds of negotiation, was $340 million. That wasn't actually the first offer, though. I want to tell you about the one before it, because I think the failure mattered as much as the eventual success. About a year before the deal that finally closed, a different, smaller acquirer had come close to a deal with us, not as large a number, closer to $90 million, but still more money than I'd ever imagined attaching to something I'd built. We were 6 weeks from closing. I'd already started mentally rehearsing what I might finally say to Richard, not out of cruelty, just out of some tired human need to finally be believed. And then, 6 weeks out, the acquirer's board got cold feet over a regulatory question in an unrelated part of their business, pulled their financing entirely, and the deal collapsed in the space of about 4 days. I don't think I've ever felt a drop quite like that one before or since. I'd let myself imagine, just slightly, what it might feel like to finally stop being the version of myself that Richard had decided I was. And then that version of myself just evaporated, and I was back to being exactly what I'd been the week before, except now also carrying the specific exhaustion of having almost escaped something and failing. I didn't tell anyone outside my immediate team that the deal had fallen apart. I went back to work the following Monday and just kept building, because at that point I genuinely didn't know what else there was to do. It took another year of growth, to more major distribution contracts, a technology upgrade to our routing platform that cut delivery windows by nearly a full day across our busiest lanes before the second offer came in, this time from a much larger conglomerate with the financing already firmly in place. I remember sitting in my lawyer's office reading that figure and feeling almost nothing at first, just a kind of numb disbelief, the way you feel when a number is so far outside your own frame of reference that it doesn't fully register as real money attached to real consequences. I didn't tell Rachel's family. I told Ethan because he deserved to know, and because at 15 he'd earned the right to understand exactly what his father had built, while everyone else assumed he was still just scraping by. I told him quietly, at our kitchen table, no dramatics, and I watched him do the math out loud, the shoulder surgery, the missing cable, the years of Grandpa Richard says, "You're bad with money," and I watched something settle in his face that I don't think had fully settled until that exact moment. Here's where the story gets complicated in a way I didn't see coming, and I want to walk you through it slowly, because this is the part that actually surprised me. The acquiring company needed regulatory approval for the deal, given the size of it, and part of that process involved a routine review of Cold Harbor's banking relationships and credit history. Standard due diligence, nothing unusual. My legal team pulled our full financial history going back to the company's founding, including, as it turned out, the original loan application I'd submitted all those years ago, the one Richard had personally flagged for denial. It turned out that decision hadn't just cost me a loan. It had cost the bank a client relationship that, over the following decade, would have been worth millions in fees and interest to them. And more importantly for what happened next, it turned out Richard's internal justification for the denial, documented in the bank's own file, cited factors that had nothing to do with my actual creditworthiness or business plan. He'd written, in an internal memo my lawyers found during due diligence, that the applicant lacks the temperament for sustained entrepreneurial discipline, a purely personal, unsubstantiated judgment with no basis in the financial documentation, the kind of thing that, when a regional bank's board reviews it during a compliance audit years later, raises very serious questions about lending discrimination and internal governance. I didn't go looking for this. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think it matters. My lawyers found it doing completely routine work, and when they brought it to me, I had a decision to make about whether to let it stay buried or whether to let the facts simply be what they were. As it happened, the bank where Richard worked was, separately, in the process of being acquired by a larger regional banking group, and Cold Harbor's now much larger parent company, post-acquisition, held a minority stake in that acquiring group. I want to be careful here, because I didn't personally orchestrate Richard's downfall, whatever it might look like from the outside. What actually happened is that during the banking group's own compliance audit, a process I had no direct hand in, internal lending records surfaced, showing a pattern of decisions by Richard across several years that didn't hold up to scrutiny. Mine wasn't even the only one. There were at least 2 other cases where he'd denied qualified applicants based on documented personal judgments rather than financial criteria. Richard was let go 11 months after the audit began, not because of me directly. I never spoke to anyone at that bank about him, never filed a complaint, never once used my position to push for it. The math just eventually did what the math does when enough of it gets looked at closely enough by people with no reason to protect anyone. I found out he'd been let go the same way most people find out things like that. Rachel called me. She was upset, understandably. Her father had just lost the job he'd held for over 3 decades. She didn't blame me, exactly. But I think some part of her wondered whether I'd played some hand in it. I told her the truth, which is that I hadn't, and I think she believed me. Because it happened to be true. I did go see Richard, about 3 weeks after he'd lost the job. Not to gloat, I want to be very clear about that. Because I know that's the moment this story is supposed to build toward. Some big confrontation where I finally get to say everything I never said. That's not what happened. I went because Ethan asked me to. He said his grandfather had been different lately, quieter, and he wanted me to check on him. Which tells you more about the kind of kid Ethan turned out to be than it tells you about me. Richard and I sat on his back porch for about 20 minutes. He looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow. The way people sometimes look once the job that shaped their whole identity is suddenly gone. He asked, at one point, whether I'd ever forgive him for the custody attorney, for the years of comments at dinner tables, for the check. I told him I didn't know yet, and that I thought that was a more honest answer than pretending it had all stopped mattering. He nodded like he'd expected that answer and maybe respected it more. Then he would have respected a quick forgiveness. He didn't apologize, not directly. Not in so many words. What he did say was, I read the acquisition numbers. 340 million. He said it quietly, almost to himself. I had you figured wrong, Danny. I had you figured wrong for a long time. Then he asked me something I didn't expect, whether the loan officer, who'd originally reviewed my application, the one who'd told me years later that my numbers had actually been strong, still worked at the bank. I told him I didn't know. He said he wanted to write her a letter, whatever that was worth at this point. I told him it might be worth more than he thought. I told him I appreciated him saying that. I didn't tell him it was too late, even though some part of me thought it. I didn't need to say it. The math had already said it for me, more clearly than any words I could have chosen. Rachel and I talked a few weeks after that, too, mostly about Richard, about how he was adjusting to retirement he'd never planned for. She told me something that stuck with me, that for years. She'd half believed her father's version of me too, not because she didn't love me, but because it's hard to fully unlearn a story you've heard your whole life from someone you trust, even when your own eyes are telling you something different. She said watching Ethan grow up steady and grounded and cared for, year after year, regardless of what account balance I had in any given month, was what had actually convinced her, long before any acquisition ever did. I think that mattered more to me than anything Richard said on that porch. I still have those 2 halves of that torn check. They're in the same drawer where I put them that day, years ago now. I take them out sometimes, not out of bitterness, but because I think it's important to remember exactly how little that moment cost the man who did it, and exactly how much it ended up costing him anyway, entirely on its own, without a single thing I had to do to make it happen. Here's what I actually think about, more than the money, more than the acquisition, more than any of it. I think about Ethan standing in that doorway at 11 years old, watching a grown man decide his father was worthless in front of him. I think about that courthouse hallway, sitting in my only suit, waiting for a hearing that never happened. I think about a napkin covered in math in a rheumatologist's waiting room. And I think about Ethan at 15, sitting across from me at our kitchen table, watching me tell him the real numbers, watching years of quiet confusion finally resolve into something like understanding. That's the part of this story that actually matters to me. Everything else, the money, the audit, the porch conversation, is just what happened to be true once enough time passed for the truth to catch up. Ethan's 17 now. He asked me last month whether he could intern at Cold Harbor over the summer, not in the office, out on the routes, same way he used to beg to visit the warehouse as a little kid. I told him that could be arranged. I think that's the actual ending to this story, if I'm honest with you. Not the check, not the audit, not the porch. Just a kid who still wants to be near the thing his father built, for no reason except that he always has. If you've ever had someone decide who you were before you'd actually finished becoming it, I want to hear about it. Tell me what that moment was, and how long it took before the facts finally caught up to what they'd decided about you. And if this story felt familiar to you in any way, Stay with me, because this isn't the only story like it I've got to tell. I never did cash in those two halves of that check, by the way. Some things aren't about the money. That one was never really about the $15,000, and I think, somewhere in that quiet conversation on his back porch, Richard finally understood that too.